Mit dem Angriff Steiners wird das alles in Ordnung kommen.
Mein Führer, Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
Es bleiben im Raum Keitel, Jodl, Krebs und Burgdorf.
So, the Monolith Deathcult, Dutch industrial symphonic death metal act, very similar to bands like the Project Hate, like a more death metal oriented version of Ministry. You know the deal. They've put out 5 full lengths so far, but really all I'm familiar with, or what Eric's familiar with, is their 2008 release, Triumvirate. Tetragrammaton, I just couldn't get into, didn't really enjoy the single too much, and Blood Cavolts, their 2015 EP, I don't know.
Never heard it. It might be alright.
Who cares? So, here we are, Versus 1, a very solid single, maybe not the single that everybody wanted, definitely a song that was not as friendly and straightforward as most singles would be concerned with. But here we are with a full length with a very strange concept, something science fiction-y and occult, based on who could have guessed Nazis and Nazi paraphernalia. And it's really a very interesting album, and we're gonna get into that here. Get into the shit of it. Let's get it over with.
Alright, the shittiest part of it for me has to be the overuse of samples. I understand they're going for a theatrical science fiction, almost like an old school 1930s, 20s science fiction movie. Like the oldest of the old with the radio announcer voice that appears throughout the whole album. But I feel like it's a little bit much. It gets distracting at times. It just putting them over riffs randomly and things like that. I feel like sometimes it just doesn't blend well and it takes away from the aggression of the music and doesn't properly mesh, really.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And while there are some highlights here and there, like I really appreciated the Whiplash samples on the Furious Gods, as well as some of the other samples strewn about, I do feel like some of them are way too on the nose, especially the one on D Glock. The damn you Jesus, which just kind of plays throughout, and it just doesn't feel apt. It doesn't feel on like it should with the beat of the instrumental and with the tracks. I'm just not feeling it. And considering that it's actually a fairly good song, I feel like it just starts on a brown note.
Fortunately, the amount of samples do lessen as the album goes on.
Okay.
They aren't as overbearing, and there are more symphonic elements, which the symphonic elements are well done. They're not overblown like certain albums we may or may not have talked about recently. Yeah, Nightbringer. But other than that, I feel like the songwriting actually gets worse in some ways. The symphonic parts increase in number, and they're good, but the last 2 songs, particularly the last song from the Stalinic perspective, it's just boring. It's 10 minutes. It's basically the same speed throughout the entire song. And for me, it just doesn't do anything. And I don't think the single, This Inhuman Place Makes Human Monsters, is very good at all. I mean, they cut it in half for the single, which didn't make any sense, but may have been the right route to go considering the song just isn't really that good.
Yeah, tonally it's just all over the place. It feels like there's a lot of mismatched ideas kind of Frankenstein together, but not in a particularly good way. Kind of reminds me of actually the recent Project Hate CD, which had a bajillion different ideas sewn together in a bunch of really strange and esoteric ways, and it just didn't work out to that album's benefit either. Fortunately, this is pretty few and far between. This isn't a huge issue considering that the majority of the CD is actually fairly good. So not a whole lot to worry about really, but it is really disappointing to see that the last 2 tracks kind of put the album out of its misery instead of giving it an appropriate send-off.
So all that said, there aren't any huge glaring flaws here.
No.
It's a lot better than certain aforementioned albums that we won't name again on this show in the industrial death metal genre. Like, for example, the concept seems really interesting. As far as I was able to glean from it, it has something to do with Nazis and mysticism or something like that.
Yeah, it gets down to all levels of spookiness. Really, it has to do with the Nazis' investigation into the occult, and it's actually, from what I can understand, all fairly accurate based on the actual investigations and scientific studies the Nazis did during World War II. And it doesn't take a pro-Nazi standing. Really, it just takes a very biographical look at it. Takes a very descriptive quality when it comes to the actual songwriting, as far as I can tell. But it is actually very interesting, and it actually permeates the instrumentals as well as the samples. You've got what sounds like some theremin throughout, or maybe some keyboard emulations of theremin to kind of enhance it and give it that 1950s, 1940s quality to it, as well as the aforementioned radio announcer kind of feel throughout. And it really gives it a quality that not a lot of albums I can think of really has. It really is to this album's benefit and really works throughout all the different tracks. Makes it feel like a whole, makes every track really feel like it's leading up to something in the end.
Another thing that also enhances the atmosphere of the album are the solos. They're not conventional sweep runs or melodic solos like that. They're more background. There's a lot of noise going on with them, behind them, and they fit well into the whole industrial, chaotic atmosphere that the album's going for. They're noisy, but they're not super dissonant, and I feel like a lot of industrial death metal that does actually try and incorporate solos doesn't do it as well as these guys do. They bring it into the narrative, and it fits the theme perfectly.
Yeah, definitely. They bring it into the instrumentals and really give it a purpose, as opposed to just having a really basic song structure and just, gotta get that solo in there somewhere and jamming it in half-assedly.
Yeah, a couple of the songs have solos, 2, 3, 4 solos in them that are peppered throughout.
Yeah.
And yeah, it really does things.
As far as solos are concerned, I actually feel like my personal favorite track on this CD actually has one of the best ones, and that is by far The Furious Gods. This track is absolutely monumental. It's probably my favorite track the band has ever made, definitely in the top 5. It definitely holds its own with anything off of Triumvirate. It just opens up with a slew of samples that are actually to the track's benefit, like the aforementioned Whiplash sample I was talking about earlier. It also has something like a German soldier sample that's actually used in a very military fashion. There's really a driving force behind the riffs here, some of the best riffs the band has put together throughout the album. It also has some really awesome gang chants, as well as a whole lot of variation throughout. It really feels like not just a series of movements, but a story. A really dedicated and focused and concise story. And that's saying something, considering the track is almost 8 or 9 minutes long. It does kind of feel like a shame that it is the first real track on the album, and it's also the best track on the CD. Mm-hmm. But all in all, I'm very satisfied that they put out a track of this magnitude, of this quality. I really wasn't expecting a whole lot after Tetragrammaton, just based on the singles that I'd heard off of that CD. But I'm actually really impressed with the quality here. So all in all, I think it's a very solid CD. It does have its caveats. It's not a perfect CD by any chance. But overall, I think it is something that you could really get down to if you like industrial death metal and you're looking for something that isn't complete shit. So, Eric, what would you give this CD?
I'll give it a 7. I think it could be more consistent. It starts off really strong, as you were saying, and it just kind of plods near the end. It just gets a little boring near the end. If they could keep it more consistent like Triumvirate, I would give it a higher score, but I think I'm going to go with a 7. It has its moments.
Yeah, I would agree with that. A 7 feels very accurate, actually. It does have its highlights, it does have some really high highs, but it also does have some moments that plod, that just kind of dwindled down into really raw and basic primitive ideas. Just some ideas that don't really go anywhere. But overall, it does feel focused enough, and it does have an interesting enough idea to merit a listen, as opposed to some of their previous releases, the aforementioned EP and the CD that came before it. I do think this is a little bit more consistent and a lot more solid in general. So definitely check it out if you like music like this. So as always, my name is Archibald.